I guess we can just kick off with ServiceNow, the platform that we are always focused on looking at. And they had some interesting announcements. Of course, like every major mega vendor, ServiceNow is now putting out 30, 40, 50 press releases associated with their event, which is honestly is a bit too much. But when we dug through the weeds, we started finding some interesting announcements in there. And I'm curious what got your attention from a starting point, looking at ServiceNow knowledge for this year.
So when I look at it, I mean, I'll preface the entire thing by saying that I was slightly underwhelmed by what they're doing. Now, in their defense, when you become this large of an organization, we've talked about this before, as organizations start to become bigger, it is really hard to continue to innovate at that kind of scale. So maybe we're holding them up to too high of a standard here, but in terms of the overall announcements, there was nothing that was like, oh wow, that was amazing or really knocked my socks off. So to me, the parts that are more interesting are the signaling, right? So one of the things, and in
Mhm.
fact, I don't know how many press releases in before I even caught this, but they are now, at least in their press releases, at least in their like about ServiceNow sections, are referring to themselves as the AI platform for business transformation. And I think that's somewhat significant, again, from a signaling as to where they're going, because they started off, of course, as an IT service management player. Then their messaging was all about enterprise service management. And then they became much more focused on workflow automation. And then increasingly, and this part I think they are still hanging on to, now they've been talking about how work gets done and this idea. And so, like I said, I almost missed it that their opening line, ServiceNow, the AI platform for business transformation, was like, oh, that's really interesting that that's where they're trying to really anchor to AI. And so, what I struggle with a little bit on this is that there is just a slew of announcements. I mean, it's like almost staggering, but they were clearly trying to make Gen AI in particular a key part of it, and it just fell a little Me Too-ish. Somewhat ironically, for a company of this size and who has been making some pretty significant investments in AI from early on, but most of these were extensions. I mean, the big breakthrough announcements, I guess, were their model for their Now Assist product is now multimodal. I want to look at the use cases to get a better handle. So, what that means, it can take more than just text. So you can input images and video and some other, I guess, audio, video, and images. Um, I'm not clear what the use cases are, if that's really as big of a deal. They also have this old BYO model kind of approach where
Mhm.
you can now use their LLM, you can use a custom LLM, or theoretically a standard LM. I don't know why you would do that. I mean, to me, I read through that one 3 times and it was scratching my head a little bit. It was like, well, on the surface, you go, of course, you want the flexibility, and I'm sure this is being driven by pressure from large enterprises that are saying I need all this flexibility. But if I look at the use cases that should be driving where ServiceNow is applied, I don't know that that's where I'd be applying a custom LLM, right? We've talked a lot about Databricks and their approach of every
Right.
enterprise building
Mhm.
their own LLM, but I look at those use cases, and so those are going to be customer facing. Those are going to be, or maybe my ERP facing, but not the kind of stuff that I would typically apply to ServiceNow. So, that one left me. Sounded good until I sort of thought about it for a minute and was like, okay. They also introduced something called Creator Studio, which is finally a true no code sort of um, view for sort of citizen development. Left a lot of unanswered questions for me as to, so do I still need low code? Presumably, because they introduced a whole bunch of Gen AI for the developer side of the platform. Clearly, that's still a huge part of what they're doing. So to me, a lot of ambiguity as to now, what do I use for what? So, to me, it was a lot of, and then a lot of the actual Gen AI stuff was sort of, stuff that others have had and they were kind of catching up on. So I was left sort of feeling underwhelmed. The most interesting thing for me, and then I want to hear your take on it, is really ironic, I guess, because it was a partnership with Genesys, is a company
Mhm.
that I've been a fan of and followed for a long time. They sort of do customer facing experience management. And so their partnership, if they now are having, they will by the end of this year, I guess, have a unified or a joint go to market that is called Unified Experience. and it's basically a turnkey application that includes both Genesys and ServiceNow's customer service management. I think it's the CSM
Mhm.
product. And the idea is it blends or hooks front office and back office together. So when you're managing that experience and there's some kind of a fall and break in that service and you need to now execute some form of internal process to fix it, now these are joined at the hip and then supposedly with this AI layer, whatever. But that I think is really interesting. And I think it's mostly interesting because I think this is the wall that ServiceNow has been unable to break, or it's been unclear if they even wanted to break it because it would put them into competition with so many people.
Mhm.
And so I think this may be the playbook for the future as they are carving out room of competing and trying to bolt these things together where they become the baked in back end to these customer facing front ends. And I think that could be a really smart play for them. So of all the sort of stuff, that was the one that I almost missed, and I think was actually the most interesting of everything I saw. So that was my take.
Yeah, moving backwards from that, I feel like there's this trend for these, call it large tech companies who are not quite uh, the mega market leaders, like the ServiceNows, the Workdays of the world, and saying kind of to be blunt, like F it, we're just gonna go for it. Like we used to have all these partners that we worked with for these niche use cases, but now we're gonna just work with the big kids. So ServiceNow is saying we're going to work with Fujitsu, we're going to work with Genesys, we're going to work with Infosys on these big solutions for customer service and manufacturing. And yeah, we used to have this ecosystem that did this, but now we're going to start bringing a lot of that in-house because honestly, we have to take them on to get that next billion or 2 billion in revenue. These companies are making big goals, big projections to say we're going to go from 5 billion, 6 billion to 10 billion to 15 billion. And you can't do that without stepping on a few toes. So now we're going to see an interesting balancing process of how do we go after those extra few billion, that next few $1 billion in revenue. And there's definitely a lot of increasing stratification of seeing more and more of that focus going towards the biggest companies and the biggest markets. So also not a mistake that they're talking about Fujitsu, as everybody wants that Japanese tech market. Moving a little bit backwards on the product side, I agree that everything sounds a little bit Me Too-ish at this point. But I do think that both ServiceNow's breadth of talking about trying to be a control plane across RPA, API integration, documents, process mining, governance, and kind of saying we want to be the centralized view for all of the agents and capabilities that you're doing across all these areas is uh, is a point of interest. It's not the only company doing that, as we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I think doing that is interesting. And I think that no code environment for that creator studio is an interesting idea in that, from my understanding, the idea here is that you can develop prompts that lead to actual applications or at least services or automated workflows that can be created going forward. So this actually creates a natural language starting point for creating apps. Whether it ends up working like that or not, and whether these apps are robust enough to actually fit into a software development lifecycle, there were, as you said, there were a lot of details that were kind of left out here. If ServiceNow can deliver on that plan, that's an interesting next step in this low code application development world that we've been looking at for the past decade or so, and an actual use case for generative AI, which may lead to some value, but we'll see. But one of the quotes I found interesting in the ServiceNow press release was an IDC quote basically saying that they expected Gen AI to grow to 40 billion in revenue in a couple of years, and then up to 150 billion a couple of years after that. And as someone who deals with a lot of ROI and business value stuff, like I look within those numbers, and basically that translates to me in IDC's thinking that there's going to be about 300 billion to 400 billion in business value that is created. Like if you work backwards from the ROI, that's basically what it translates into. So now all these companies are of course they're happy about those IDC numbers, but now they have to make those cases for how that $300 billion in business value is going to be created. I'm not wedded to that number. I don't know how much I believe that number, but I do think that is kind of a commitment in a number that a lot of vendors are now going to be trying to fit themselves into.
Well, we're gonna talk about this later, I think, but this leads to like I have great respect for IDC, and I think overall, I generally trust their data, but this one I find very suspect. I find it very suspect on both fronts. One to your point, the ROI of the business value. I think right now that is still very much an unknown quantity. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I don't think there's any clear pathways for most organizations to anywhere near those numbers. And I think as a result, we're not seeing the spending. We're seeing a lot of experimentation, but we aren't seeing that heavy spending. The other thing there was so much in the ServiceNow announcements. There's another quote that their Now Assist, which is their Gen AI product, supposedly their best-selling product in history. Now, I don't know enough about their pricing. That was staggering to me, if that's true, but I don't know. Again, they didn't expose any of the mechanics of exactly what that meant. So, but if it's a significant price point and that's a significant amount of revenue, then that would in fact be a more stronger indication of this. I find it a little suspect. So we'll see where all that kind of lands around it. But I look at, I mean, they had there was another one that was a kind of weird thing. They had this big focus. They kept bringing it up about their strategic portfolio management. So this is one of their Now Assist bots, and I just found it so interesting that this, what I feel was a fairly narrow banded kind of application, got so much space. So, I feel like there's just so much grasping at this. And I feel like there's, again, the article that we're going to talk about later, so much grasping for just being relevant, of being included in all the hype and all the conversations around it. And I guess, maybe I'm holding ServiceNow to too high of a standard, but that disappoints me a little bit, because one of the things that I've always appreciated about ServiceNow is they were very focused on delivering on the pragmatic execution, and this just felt a little hypey. So,
Yeah. I always find portfolio management solutions interesting because I feel like they're very attractive to tech product managers because they are about managing products. And of course, tech product managers love tools that help them to manage products. But honestly, not everybody in IT thinks of every service and every asset and every capability as a product. Maybe they should. Maybe that's the best way to think of IT as a business. But the reality is, as we know from talking to CIOs across the board, this is not a common mindset. There are definitely companies that do think about every IT service as a product because of that IT as a business mindset, but it is not the prevalent majority CIO or IT mindset out there. So I think this is to some extent ServiceNow wanting portfolio and product management to be more important to the IT office than it actually is.
it could be. Well, and that brings up one last point before I know we need to move on to talk about, we'll go to Boomi next here. But the one other thing to talk about, I think, was that if I were to boil everything that they announced across the spectrum here and boil it up, the one big message that got through loud and clear is that they are focusing on the very largest companies, their partnerships, their products, all of this was telegraphing that they're focusing on the very, very large companies. And I think if you're a smaller organization using ServiceNow, that at least potentially should give you pause, because that is really where they are clearly and as no surprise, I guess, with the numbers that they're putting out and the numbers they're telegraphing here, they have to. I mean, they have to get to this massive scale, and that's going to make it harder for them to continue to focus on the smaller organizations, at least in their needs. So anyway,
Right.
that's
It's a little reminiscent of Salesforce, how they went enterprise and then HubSpot came up to take up that mid-market from them.
And I think that it definitely is going to be leaving some room here. So and that's going to be its own little.
So you said
fight,
last week
but
ITSM was dead, but despite that, there might still be an opportunity for mid-market ITSM now.
a mid-market service now. I don't know that an ITSM play is going to do it, but the idea of following that playbook, but focusing on the mid-market, I think there may be something there.